The smell of old paper and dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun was the scent of Elias's life now. He sat in the worn armchair, its floral pattern faded like a distant memory, and watched his wife, Clara, his North Star, his anchor, his entire world, was sitting by the window, her gaze fixed on a robin pecking at the grass. But he knew she wasn't seeing the robin. Her eyes, the same brilliant blue that had captivated him 60 years ago, were now like frosted glass, looking at a world he couldn't enter. He held a small, smooth object in his palm, a wooden bird whittled from a single piece of maple, its surface polished by decades of touch. He had carved it for her on their 5th anniversary. Now it was just a piece of wood. "Look, Clara," he said, his voice a soft, gravelly thing. He held the bird out to her. "Remember this little fellow?" She turned her head slowly, her eyes drifting over the bird and then to his face. There was no flicker of recognition, just a polite, vacant smile she might offer a stranger. "That's nice," she murmured, her voice thin as a whisper, and turned back to the window. The words were a gentle stab in his heart, a pain he'd grown accustomed to, but one that never truly dulled. Every day was a series of these small, quiet heartbreaks. He was the keeper of their shared history, a lonely librarian in a library of 2, where the only other patron had forgotten how to read. He closed his eyes, the wooden bird warm in his hand, and let the current of memory pull him back. It was under the old willow by Miller's Creek. He was 17, all gangly limbs, and a nervous stutter he couldn't control whenever Clara smiled. She was 16, with a laugh that sounded like wind chimes and hair the color of spun gold. "What are you staring at, Ely?" she'd asked, nudging him with her shoulder. He'd been staring at the way the sunlight filtered through the willow leaves, making patterns on her face. "Just thinking." "About what?" He took a deep breath. "About how I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make you laugh just like that." She'd blushed, a lovely rose color spreading across her cheeks. She leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "Promise." He had met her gaze, the world shrinking to just the 2 of them under the whispering tree. "Always." She smiled, a brilliant, beautiful thing. "Always." That word became their anchor. It was whispered over late night phone calls, written in the margins of school notebooks, and sealed with a kiss on their wedding day. Always. A promise of forever. He remembered the day he bought the plot of land on Hemlock Hill. It was nothing but overgrown weeds and a stubborn oak tree. "It's perfect," Clara had declared, twirling in the center of the field. He'd spent the next year building their house with his own 2 hands, every nail hammered in, with a vision of their future. He built her a window seat in the living room, the one she was sitting in now, so she could watch the seasons change. They had filled that house with life. The smell of Clara's apple pies, the sound of their daughter, Lily learning to walk on the hardwood floors he'd laid, the quiet evenings spent reading by the fire. Life wasn't a grand adventure, but a collection of small, perfect moments. A shared cup of coffee on the porch at dawn, his hand finding hers in the dark of a movie theater. The way she'd hum off key while gardening. Those were the memories he clung to, the ones he replayed in the silence of the house. The first sign was small, almost comical. She'd put the car keys in the refrigerator. They'd laughed about it, blaming it on age. Then she forgot their neighbor's name, a woman they'd known for 30 years. Then she got lost driving home from the grocery store, a route she could have navigated in her sleep. The diagnosis felt like a physical blow, a thief breaking into their home not to steal possessions, but to steal Clara herself, piece by piece. Alzheimer's. The doctor had explained it with clinical detachment. Tangles, plaques, a slow, irreversible fading. Elias had held Clara's hand so tightly his knuckles were white, as if he could physically stop her from drifting away. That night, she'd cried in his arms. "I don't want to forget you, Eli," she'd sobbed. "Please don't let me forget you." He had held her, his own tears soaking into her hair. "You won't." He'd promised, a lie born of desperate love. "I'll be here. I'll remember for both of us. Always." The first few years were a slow descent. There were good days, days filled with flashes of the old Clara. She'd remember a song from their youth, or tell a story about Lily's childhood with perfect clarity. On those days, Elias would feel a surge of hope so fierce it was painful, a belief that he could somehow love her back to health. But the good days became rarer, islands in a vast, foggy sea. Soon, she forgot their daughter's name. Lily would visit, her face a mask of patient grief, and Clara would greet her with the same polite confusion she offered the postman. Then she started forgetting him. At first, she'd look at him with a puzzled frown. "Do I know you?" she would ask, her head tilted. He would patiently explain, showing her their wedding album, the photos of a life lived side by side. Sometimes it worked. A flicker of recognition would cross her face, a brief clearing in the clouds. But the clouds always rolled back in, thicker and darker than before. Now, he was simply the kind man who brought her meals, who helped her dress, who sat with her in the quiet afternoons. She was never afraid of him. In fact, she seemed to find a placid comfort in his presence. But the intimacy, the shared soul they had built over a lifetime, was gone. He was a stranger in his own love story. He opened his eyes, the memory fading back into the sunlit room. The robin had flown away. Clara was now tracing patterns on the dusty window pane with her finger. Elias got up, his joints protesting with a groan, and walked over to the old record player in the corner. He carefully placed the needle on a worn vinyl record. The soft, scratchy notes of Etta James's, "At Last," filled the room. Their song he had proposed to her on a dance floor, swaying to this very melody. He had held her in his arms, the music wrapping around them like a blanket, and asked her to be his wife. He walked back to her and held out his hand. "May I have this dance?" he asked, just as he had 60 years ago. She looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his face. For a moment, her brow furrowed. The music swirled around them, a ghost of 1,000 other dances. He held his breath, praying for a miracle, for a single spark in the darkness. She placed her hand in his. It was a fragile, weightless thing. He gently pulled her to her feet. He placed one of her hands on his shoulder and held the other, leading her in a slow, shuffling circle in the middle of the living room. Her movements were stiff, uncoordinated, but she followed his lead. He hummed along with the music, his cheek resting against her soft, white hair. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, she wasn't a frail old woman lost in a fog. She was his Clara, the girl with the laugh like wind chimes, the woman who had built a life with him from nothing but love and stubborn will. They swayed in silence as the song played on. The world outside the window, the ticking clock on the mantelpiece, the very air in the room seemed to hold its breath. And then it happened. Her body, which had been rigid, softened against his. Her hand on his shoulder tightened its grip, not with confusion, but with familiarity. He felt a tremor run through her. He pulled back just enough to look at her face. The fog in her eyes was gone. The brilliant, piercing blue was back, and they were looking directly at him, seeing him. A tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. "Eli," she whispered. His name, she had said his name. His own eyes filled with tears, blurring her face into a watercolor painting. He couldn't speak. His heart, so used to the dull ache of loss, was now pounding with a joy so intense it felt like pain. "My Ali," she said again, her voice clearer than it had been in years. She lifted a trembling hand and touched his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "You're still so handsome." He let out a choked sob, a sound that was half laugh, half cry. "Clara, our song," she murmured, her gaze filled with a lifetime of love. "You remembered our song." "I remember everything," he whispered, leaning his forehead against hers. "For both of us." She smiled, a real smile, the one that had lit up his world for 60 years. "Always?" she asked, the single word a sacred echo from their past. He squeezed her hand, pouring every ounce of his love, his grief, and his undying devotion into that one touch. "Always," he replied. For a few perfect, crystalline moments, they were just Eli and Clara, swaying to their song in the house they had built, suspended in a bubble of time where no disease could touch them. He held her, breathing in the scent of her, memorizing the feel of her hand in his, the clarity in her eyes. It was a gift, a fleeting moment of grace in a long, cruel goodbye, but like a beautiful dream upon waking, it began to fade. He felt the change first. The light in her eyes began to dim. The focus softened, the recognition wavering like a candle flame in a breeze. The hand on his face slipped down, her expression slowly smoothing out into that familiar, placid emptiness. It's a nice song," she said, her voice once again thin and distant. She pulled her hand from his. "I'm a little tired now." And just like that, she was gone again. The music ended, the needle hissing on the final groove of the record. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than before. He had had her back for only a minute, and losing her all over again was a fresh, brutal agony. He helped her back to her chair by the window. She sat down without a word, her gaze once again fixed on the world outside. Elias sank back into his own armchair, his body feeling impossibly heavy. The wooden bird was still clutched in his hand. He looked from the bird to the woman by the window. His stranger, his wife, his everything. The tears he'd been holding back finally fell, silent tracks on a weathered face. They weren't tears of despair, not entirely. They were tears of gratitude for that one, stolen minute. A minute that would have to sustain him through all the empty tomorrows. He was the keeper of their story. And even if she could no longer hear it, he would keep telling it, right until the very end. He reached out and took her hand. It lay limp in his, but he held it anyway. He leaned close, his voice a broken whisper against her skin. "Always,"